Welcome back to the first Great Western of 2025 after an extended layoff. But in this edition, we are looking at Terry Wilson's book, Let It Be, The Making of the Beatles' Final Album. And this is 2024 or 2025's Book 1, The Twickenham Rehearsals. And I'm hoping that, as promised in 2026, Terry Wilson will produce Volume 2, which will cover the making of Let It Be at the Apple Studios later on in January 1969. So welcome to this Great Western book review. This is a book about correcting misconceptions. For many decades, the film Let It Be languished somewhere and was not generally available to the public unless you had an old VHS video copy. And yet parts of that film were notorious. One scene in Let It Be features a row between Paul McCartney and George Harrison, prompting George's famous line, which goes something like this: "I'll play it your way, or I won't play it at all. Whatever will please you, I'll do it." An exasperated George says to Paul McCartney. That scene from the film and George Harrison's subsequent departure from the Twickenham rehearsals gives the impression that this all took place on a single day. But this is the sort of misconception that Terry Wilson is anxious to correct. In fact, that argument took place on a Tuesday and George Harrison left the sessions on the Friday. So there were an intervening 3 days between George's departure from the Beatles and the argument. This rehabilitation of Beatles history arguably began in 1995 with the Anthology series, which was a rather bland portrayal of four people who didn't really seem to have a clue why they split up, apart from getting married. But I suppose that was the political nature of that documentary. And then we fast forward past the pandemic to 2021 and Peter Jackson's superb, if rather lengthy, Get Back documentary. And here we do start to see the rehabilitation of the year 1969 for the Beatles. And it's fair to say that Peter Jackson's documentary gets over something that the film Let It Be never did. That these sessions were often fun and full of gossip and full of musical interludes and laughter. So the rehabilitation has arguably begun already, but Terry Wilson is still anxious to correct misconceptions. In this book, we see John, Paul, George and Ringo in a fair and balanced light. Personal differences are played down and known arguments and cross-words are contextualized and often smoothed out. Now, I wasn't aware of the Nagra tapes, but it is a well-known and lengthy Beatles bootleg of the Twickenham sessions, recorded in parallel with the film recordings of Michael Lindsay-Hogg's team. The tapes are apparently rather hard to decipher, very lengthy, and sometimes unlistenable because of so much crosstalk, chatter, and background noises drowning out the music. But here's an interesting detail, that Michael Lindsay-Hogg's camera crew were often blocked by the Beatles from listening in to the Beatles' conversations. So when the Beatles, who were being filmed almost continuously through these rehearsals, had something important to say to one another, one or other of the Beatles, if they remembered, they would strum their guitar loudly or use other means to block the sensitive conversation that was going on. However, this didn't stop Michael Lindsay-Hogg from planting listening devices in key parts of the studio and the canteen. But it's this detail from the Nagra bootleg that Terry Wilson bases the premise of his book on. And it's similar to Peter Jackson's premise, that these were often fun, productive times with some camaraderie and laughter, and playing down a lot of the alleged conflict and tension. But nonetheless, some people come out of this book better than others. Who are the villains of Terry Wilson's first volume on Let It Be? Paul McCartney. is one of the villains, and yet Wilson is also careful to point out that although he did often talk down to George Harrison, although he did often particularly tell George what to play, but not just George, Ringo often got an earful as well, although not during these sessions it seems, but Paul is also portrayed as diplomatic and anxious to correct things when things have gone wrong, such as George temporarily leaving the Beatles. So Paul McCartney comes across as a bit of a villain of the piece, as does his wife Linda, who doesn't get mentioned much because she wasn't at the sessions that often. But on one occasion when she was, she and Paul got together and gave Michael Lindsay-Hogg, the director of the subsequent film, a bit of a dressing down about some of his previous Beatles films, and also Linda decided to give him a lesson in photography based on her own extensive experience of that art. This wasn't a very helpful intervention, needless to say, but there is some negativity surrounding the McCartneys. But in fairness to Wilson, McCartney also comes across as organised, often affable, laughing and joking, and out of all four Beatles, he is the most eager to get on and work and have a plan. And I think he is to be admired for that. It probably wouldn't be a huge surprise if I now mentioned John Lennon and Yoko Ono. But there's a twist to this. John Lennon generally comes across as quite good-humoured, reasonably focused, although he doesn't have a lot of songs to bring, and generally positive and productive. But as the rehearsals continue, John turns up later and later and later, and there is a strong hint that he is on something, some sort of drugs, legal or illegal. Wilson doesn't really speculate, but there is a definite dropping off of focus and interest in the Let It Be sessions at Twickenham for John. Now, Yoko Ono is probably one of the most reviled Beatles wives ever, but she's portrayed pretty fairly in this book. She attends, I believe, all of the rehearsals, unlike Linda McCartney or any of the other Beatle spouses. And for the most part, she sits silently, if rather icily, and watches the proceedings wordlessly. But she does begin to pipe up a bit more as the sessions proceed, and she also sits in on George's cushion when he has temporarily left the band. And in fact, there is a famous incident where Paul, John, Ringo and Yoko Ono make a cacophony of noise, excising that difficult spirit of George having suddenly and unexpectedly quit the band. But Terry Wilson is pretty fair to Yoko Ono, and any manoeuvring or difficulty that she caused the band is no doubt in the future. So those are the villains of the piece. In the middle of A Day in the Life, Paul McCartney wrote this famous line, "Woke up, got out of bed and dragged a comb across my head." Not perhaps his greatest lyrics, but there was a detail there in that everyday life aspect. And this book is full of everyday life aspect. In fact, Wilson speculates on what each Beatle did every evening after the rehearsals. Who went home, who went to parties, who was with their wife, and who was watching TV, and what were they watching. This is very interesting, and I think this has certainly gone further than anything I've ever read about Beatles trivia. Now, how has he done this? Well, he's consulted, I think, all the historical records of the Beatles movements. Then he has consulted the TV listings, no doubt the radio times of 1969, to find out what programs were on. And then cleverly, he has linked in that information to snippets of what the Beatles were talking about on the Nagra tapes or in Get Back or the Let It Be movie to find out what their viewing habits were. It's very, very interesting. But this may be a level of detail too far for some Beatles fans, though maybe actually I doubt it. I don't think less is more when it comes to Beatles trivia and what Beatles fans are after. So Wilson's book, I think, actually is really, really strong here. But I'm not kidding. Literally every evening after the rehearsals and both of the weekends, spanned during those rehearsals are speculated upon and logged in some detail. So this is an impressive bit of scholarship, although it may be too much for some people. Do I recommend this book? Yes, I recommend it. I recommend it particularly if the price is right. I got this for UK sterling £7.49 on Kindle. If you can get it cheaper, I would certainly grab it. It's not a really, really long read, and it only covers 2 weeks of the Beatles' lives. But as I've said, there are some interesting and new and compelling aspects to this book that I think Beatles fans will find interesting. Another recent book is the Paul McCartney Legacy by Kozninn and Sinclair, volumes 1 and 2 of that. That is also an incredibly detailed piece of scholarship about Paul McCartney's recording habits and the history of Wings in the 1970s. And I recently read volume 2 of the McCartney Legacy, and I was stunned by the level of detail. But I have to say, Terry Wilson has further stunned me with the incredible level of detail of the Beatles' lives in the first 2 weeks of 1969. Do I recommend this book? Yes, I do. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you, Terry Wilson, and thank you for watching Great Western. I'll see you soon. Thank you so much for watching Great Western, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please like this video and consider subscribing, because by doing that you will really encourage me, and there will be further insights into music, TV, tech and much more. Thanks so much. Bye bye.